I find that these days I don't go hiking as much as I used to. But growing up in the mountains, hiking was a huge part of my youth. As I was growing up, my favorite places to hike always included the Grayson Highlands State Park near the North Carolina border. It was the home of Mount Rogers, Virginia's tallest peak. My Boy Scout troop was full of a bunch of foolish, high-adventure, adrenaline seekers who we'd always go hike Mount Rogers in December in the midst of knee-deep snow because we liked to make good choices. I always slightly preferred going on the more pleasant hikes in the spring in the Grayson Highlands with my family and friends. And I think it was my favorite place to hike because the path was never boring. We hiked up and down through deep valleys and across high peaks. There were these dense rhododendron groves that were beautiful and foreboding, and there were wide panoramic views all around. There were barren, rocky, and icy fields, and then there were lush meadows with wild ponies. In a wide wilderness of diversity, the only constant seemed to be the path beneath our feet. Growing up along the trails of the Grayson Highlands, I began to understand the experience of faith and life to be a lot like those hikes. Life is full of highs and lows, of deep valleys of sorrow with high peaks of hope. We walk through seasons in life that have felt as dense and foreboding and suffocating as those rhododendron thickets. And I've known days where I stood with panoramic clarity like I was on a mountaintop, seeing with joy all the goodness of God spread before me. I ventured down those trails with a multitude of hiking buddies, some of whom still walk with me and others who've gone wildly different ways. I think I can say the same for the many different paths I've trekked in my life. I always felt like I was learning something about God and about myself on those trails. Those trails showed that life is not just about walking some straight and narrow path, but rather it's about the wide journey, marked with many different crisscrossed paths, many different choices, each bringing their own unique highs and lows. No one path forward through the vast wilderness of life promises a purely easy journey. While certainly some paths we choose promise to be more challenging, and some paths are, for better or for worse, chosen for us. Yet the path beneath our feet, the sacred opportunity to keep on the journey through the goodness of God that is all around us, remains a constant. The life and faith of Joseph was much like one of these hikes. Joseph was the son of Jacob, who was known as Israel. Israel's father was Isaac and his father Abraham, of whom we heard last week through God's call and promise. Joseph was one of the 12 sons of Jacob, the eventual heads of the 12 tribes of Israel. Joseph's life was full of ups and downs, of hills and valleys, triumphs and despair, all of which are outlined in this little novella in the conclusion of Genesis. Joseph is the one with the cloak of many colors, the one who's loved most by his father and then hated by his brothers. He's given favor by his father, and his brothers think about murdering him, but decide instead to throw him in a pit and tear his cloak and sell him into slavery. And then today's story unfolds. From this dark valley of slavery and his brother's plot, Joseph rises to great influence and responsibility in Potiphar's house. And then Potiphar's wife abuses her power over this devoted servant, not only putting Joseph in a horrific situation, but layering lies upon it that land him in prison, where he then finds favor with the chief of the jail and is once again entrusted with responsibilities even in his most hopeless hour. And his story goes on with a series of dream interpretations that seem to be his ticket to freedom, and then he's forgotten by a cupbearer and left to sit in jail for 2 long years. But then he's finally remembered and interprets dreams for Pharaoh of abundance and of famine. He becomes Pharaoh's right-hand man and leads Egypt through seasons of harvest and stewards them faithfully through the prophesied famine. He encounters his brothers again as they come begging for food in the midst of famine. He puts them to the test and reveals himself to his brothers as being still alive. He reconciles with them. He sees his distraught father again, and his father, who thought he'd never be able to bless his grandchildren, does so. And the people of Israel move to the abundant land of Goshen in Egypt. And then the Exodus begins. Highs and lows, ups and downs, mountains and valleys, joy and treachery. Joseph's story has it all. But through all of these highs and lows, Joseph displays a tremendous faith and hope. He's always seeking the welfare of all around him. Whether he's in the halls of Potiphar and Pharaoh, the prisons of Egypt, the place of governor, or denying Potiphar's wife an act of infidelity, Joseph is always looking out for the well-being, the flourishing of those around him. It is in the welfare of all people that God is glorified, and Joseph trusts that God is with him. No matter how the scenery changes, Joseph seems to trust the path beneath his feet. Though it may and did have many branches and turns, Joseph keeps following the path of God, a way of humility and trust, of compassion and abundance. Not every path was a good one, and our story today places Joseph in the deepest of valleys where he truly cannot see the way forward. But he presses on the path of presence, of God's promise of presence, of God's promise of the flourishing of Joseph's people throughout the generations. Now, this kind of faithfulness that we see from him is not easy. I'll be the first to admit I didn't always love the trails that I was on, even when I was hiking through my favorite place. I didn't like it when my Scoutmaster's trekking poles were sticking out the top of his pack and hitting every branch above him and dumping snow back on me. I didn't like it when the winds were 40 miles per hour and the ice was coming down sideways and my eyelashes froze together. I didn't like plenty of the paths that I was on, and I tried to find my way off or my way back more times than I can count. So Joseph's commitment to finding a way forward is to be commended. I'm sure most of us can say the same thing for life, where fears and valleys derailed our faith in the path beneath our feet and the God who claimed to be with us. Joseph's faithfulness is to be a model and a guide, and is truly an aspirational way of life. He journeys on the path with us today through this story to show us a way of trust and promise. God is with us as God was with him. God keeps God's promises. And while the scenery and circumstances of life may change around us, God is faithful. God is near. God is transforming our lives and our community here at Muhlenberg. Even through a terrible season of pandemic and fear and uncertainty, look around us. God is here, and God is doing something new in this place. We are simply called as people of God to walk together, to be there for our neighbors, to seek the welfare and flourishing of all God's people as Joseph did, to hold hands and guide one another through the darkest valleys with the assurance of God's transforming presence. Later on in Genesis 45, when Joseph finally reveals to his brothers that he is alive and has risen to a great place of responsibility alongside Pharaoh, he proclaims God's transforming power to them, saying, "And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life." This isn't merely Joseph saying, "Don't worry, everything happens for a reason," or offering other empty platitudes. This is Joseph saying, "Yes, brothers, what you did was senseless and wrong, but God was with me, And I trusted the path beneath my feet, and I kept walking in a way that uplifted and preserved the life of all people. And here we are, dear brothers, in the midst of God doing a new thing for us and for the generations that will follow. Church, we walk on the path of presence, the path of a God who is with us. We proclaim that promise to one another in this community each time we gather for worship, each time we check in with one another, each time we commit to growing and serving together. But the path we have in front of us and beneath our feet is not going to be easier because we are faithful. The circumstances of life and people like Potiphar's wife who lie and harm and coerce will be there to ensure that life is full of valleys and dense thickets. But the God of resurrection and new life will be there as well to lead us in the ways of flourishing for the sake of all people, where the hope and joy of God is laid before us like on a mountaintop with panoramic splendor, and we find ourselves rejoicing in the abundance and hope that is already at hand. Let us walk this path together, sustained by water, word, and meal, uplifted by the good community, good company that is all around. In the footsteps of Joseph, let us walk the path of presence, trusting that God is near and that we will see the goodness of God's kingdom if we but trust in God to guide us. Amen.